Hey guys, tonight we start with something so ordinary, so unassuming, that most of us might walk past it without a second thought. But in the Middle Ages, it was the lifeblood of survival. A pot that simmered endlessly over smoky hearths, filled with a bubbling concoction known simply as pottage. You may think of soup as comfort food, but in the medieval world, pottage was more than comfort. It was culture, economy, class, and survival, all stirred into one humble stew. Imagine a world without supermarkets, without refrigeration, without drive-through meals. Every bite you had depended on what grew outside your cottage door, what could be bought at market with a handful of coins, or what the season, merciless or generous, decided to grant. And night after night, you would crouch near that fire, your eyes stinging with smoke, your belly gnawing with hunger, waiting for that pot to bubble just long enough to soften yesterday's bread crusts. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love to know, where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it for you? Drop it in the comments below, and let's see how far this story travels while the world sleeps. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn down the volume for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The smoke curls in your eyes as you lean closer to that cauldron, the liquid inside catching faint gleams of firelight. You hear the crackle of logs, the hiss of sap escaping bark, the low burble of stew thickening with each passing moment. There's something hypnotic about watching food transform under heat. One moment, it's raw roots and stale crusts. The next, it's a sustaining meal. While we today flip through recipes or scroll food blogs, medieval folk didn't think of pottage as a recipe. It wasn't written down, not in cookbooks for peasants at least. It was a living tradition, improvisation at its most essential. You threw in what you had, stirred, waited, prayed it would be enough. And that's the mystery, because while kings feasted on venison and nobles poured out sweet wine, the common heartbeat of Europe was in these simple pots. Pottage connected everyone. Peasants, monks, even lords on fasting days. A single dish, endlessly reshaped. Historians still argue whether this stew should be considered the national dish of medieval Europe, or if that phrase is too modern, too neat. But when you imagine villages across England, France, Germany, Poland, all huddled around the same bubbling pot, it's hard not to see pottage as the quiet monarch of the medieval table. Now close your eyes for a moment and picture yourself stepping into a medieval cottage. The floor is packed dirt, scattered with straw to keep it less muddy. The air smells of damp wool and smoke. A single fire pit blazes in the center, and above it hangs that all-important cauldron. You see steam rising, hear the plop of a carrot falling in, the hiss as a ladle stirs. Children cluster around, clutching wooden spoons, waiting. A dog noses the floor for scraps. And you're suddenly aware of how thin the walls are against the cold. That pot isn't just dinner. It's warmth. It's survival. Archaeologists studying medieval settlements have found cauldrons so worn that their metal bottoms were paper thin, kept alive by careful patching. Some families used the same cooking pot for generations. Think about that. Your stew pot wasn't just a kitchen item. It was a family heirloom, as vital as land or livestock. Some medieval folks believed that never washing the pot fully gave the stew a deeper flavor, a kind of continuous seasoning. Imagine inheriting not only grandma's pot, but also a few decades worth of onion juice baked into the metal. Appetizing or horrifying? You decide. You can feel the coziness creeping into your bones as you linger near this bubbling stew. The steam clings to your hair, softening the chill in the air. Your stomach growls, and you dip a wooden spoon in, tasting something earthy, smoky, faintly sweet. Maybe it's barley, maybe cabbage, maybe a turnip or two. There's no recipe to confirm. But the taste is always the same. Life stretched thin, flavored with patience. And here's a playful thought to keep you smiling as you drift. If you had to survive on a single dish every night, would you prefer endless pottage or modern endless pizza? Be honest. Somewhere out there, a medieval peasant would probably trade places with you in a heartbeat. But then again, you might just find their smoky stew strangely comforting. The fire pops louder, smoke settles low, and the stew continues to bubble as if it could outlast the centuries. Remember this, in the medieval world, as much as swords, crowns, or castles defined history, so did the humble cauldron. It kept families alive, told stories through taste, and whispered of resilience in the face of scarcity. And that's where your journey begins tonight, right here by the hearth, listening to the quiet song of pottage as it carries you deeper into the Middle Ages. You dip your spoon again, and this time what you taste is thicker, heartier, because no pottage lived alone. It always had a partner, and that partner was bread. Not the fluffy, sliced supermarket kind you might butter while scrolling your phone. No, the bread of medieval Europe was rough, dense, sometimes so tough you'd swear it could double as a weapon. But paired with pottage, it became magic. You soak the hard crust in the hot broth. Watch it soften, and suddenly your bowl is more filling than it has any right to be. Bread and broth were inseparable. The grains gave the stew body. The stew gave the bread life. In some cottages, bread was dropped directly into the pot, melting down into the mixture until it resembled porridge more than soup. Other times, the bread was used as a trencher, basically a thick slice serving as an edible plate. By the end of the meal, the trencher was soggy, flavorful, and usually passed down to the poorest at the table, or tossed to the dogs lurking near the fire. Trenchers at feasts were sometimes collected after the meal and donated to the poor waiting outside. Imagine finishing dinner at a castle and handing your gravy-soaked bread slab to a hungry stranger at the gate. Grains were the backbone of pottage. Barley, oats, rye, wheat if you were lucky and rich. You stir the pot and feel the texture of softened grains sliding through the broth, thickening it. These were calorie-dense, easy to store, and endlessly versatile. A single sack of barley could carry a family through the harshest months, especially when stretched with vegetables or herbs from the garden. And here's your mainstream fact. Historians estimate that in medieval England, bread and grain-based foods made up more than half of a peasant's calories. Half. Picture yourself eating oatmeal, barley soup, or bread in some form for nearly every meal of your life. Breakfast, barley porridge. Supper, barley and pottage. Midnight snack, probably stale barley bread if you were desperate. But historians still argue whether this reliance on grain meant better survival or worse nutrition. On one hand, grains are steady, dependable, full of fiber. On the other, too much reliance meant protein deficiencies, brittle bones, and stunted growth. Think of it like living on endless instant noodles. Filling, yes, but not exactly balanced. You can almost hear the debate echo across centuries. Professors raising eyebrows over barley kernels, while students sneak their sandwiches into lecture halls. Now imagine the sensory world of this grain-driven diet. The crunch of a stale crust, The chew of coarse bread, its flour dark with bits of bran. The smell of roasted barley as it bubbles into a sticky porridge. And the sound of spoons scraping the bottom of wooden bowls, hoping to gather every last grain. You'd find children fighting over the thick crust that had soaked up the richest broth, the father's voice scolding them, yet his own spoon darting faster to catch the best bite. You glance at the pot again and notice how the grains stretch the stew. What might have been a thin, watery broth suddenly feels hearty. Bread crumbles, oats dissolve, and what you taste now is a meal designed not just for flavor, but for endurance. This is food that carries you into the fields, that keeps you swinging a scythe from dawn until dusk. And in this moment, you can't help but laugh softly at yourself. Because if you lived in the Middle Ages, the phrase gluten-free wouldn't have meant a trendy diet. It would have meant starvation. Bread was survival, plain and simple. So when you hear people today say, "I could never live without bread," they're not exaggerating. They're unconsciously channeling centuries of human truth. Let's add one more quirky detail to keep the picture vivid. In some villages, communal ovens baked loaves for entire neighborhoods. Families would bring their dough, marked with a special stamp or carving, so they could identify their bread later. You can almost imagine the chaos. Children chasing each other while mothers argue over whose turn it is, and the smell of hundreds of loaves drifting into the air, tempting everyone. Even the priests across the street. The firelight flickers as you lean back, spoon still in hand, belly warm. Bread, broth, barley. That's the trinity you can't escape tonight. And though you might laugh at the rough crusts and endless porridge, deep down, you know the truth. Without these humble grains, Europe's story would have ended in silence long before the printing press, the Renaissance, or the New World. The history of pottage isn't just a tale of soup. It's the tale of how grains became the thread stitching together the fabric of daily life. You bend over the pot again, and this time, what floats to the top isn't barley or bread. It's something green, something with a little bite. Vegetables, the real backbone of medieval pottage. Without them, the stew would have been nothing but watery grain, bland and uninspiring. But with them, it became endlessly changeable. You scoop up a chunk of leek, soft and sweet after simmering for hours, and you realize why medieval gardens mattered so much. They weren't just pretty patches of land, they were survival machines. Step outside that smoky cottage and picture the cottage garden. It's not rows of neat straight lines like a modern farm. It's more like a jumble, a tangle of whatever could grow in the soil. Cabbages huddle in one corner, broad green leaves catching morning dew. Turnips and parsnips lie hidden beneath the earth, waiting to be pulled. Beans climb up rough poles, twisting like they have secrets to share. And leeks, endless leeks, stand proud like green spears planted against hunger itself. You, trudging through mud with a basket, pick what's ripe, toss it into the pot, and just like that, tonight's pottage changes its flavor. Vegetables like cabbage, leeks, onions, and turnips were staples across medieval Europe, not just side dishes. They carried essential nutrients, even if peasants didn't know the word vitamin. Without these greens and roots, their diets would have been dangerously deficient. Archaeological digs in old cesspits, yes, archaeologists do study ancient poop, show clear evidence of seeds from these vegetables, confirming just how common they were in daily meals. And then, medieval people believed that onions could cure almost anything, from headaches to snake bites to, oddly enough, marital problems. Some recipes called for wearing an onion slice around the neck, like a smelly necklace, to ward off illness. So when you chop one for your pottage, you're not just seasoning, you're participating in medieval medicine. Who needs Tylenol when you've got a kitchen that doubles as an apothecary? Still, historians argue whether peasants really had as much vegetable variety as we like to imagine. Was every cottage brimming with cabbages and beans? Or did scarcity mean that some families relied mostly on one or two dependable crops? The debate continues, but the image of the abundant garden persists. Perhaps because it's comforting to think of medieval life as always having something fresh to stir into the pot. You crouch lower and inhale. The scent of boiled cabbage fills your nose. Not exactly glamorous, but strangely grounding. Carrots, if they appear, aren't the bright orange you're picturing. Back then, carrots came in purple, white, even yellow. Picture yourself lifting a purple carrot slice from your bowl, marveling at how the color bleeds into the broth like watercolor paint. Children laugh when the soup turns slightly violet, and suddenly dinner feels like a feast, even if it's just roots and leaves. And while the vegetables cook down into softness, you can't help but picture the rhythm of seasons guiding every pot. In spring, fresh greens and herbs tumble in, bright and tender. In autumn, root vegetables thicken the stew, dense and filling. In winter, when the ground freezes, families dig up the last of their stored turnips and thank the saints they had the foresight to bury them in pits. Every spoonful you taste now carries not just flavor, but time itself, the very cycle of planting and harvest woven into a humble broth. The fire pops and spits as you stir. You imagine children sneaking a bean from the pot when their mother isn't looking, burning their tongues, but too impatient to wait. You picture an old man slurping the broth slowly, remembering a summer long gone when the garden was more generous. You hear a joke from the corner about leeks making your breath so strong it could slay a dragon, and everyone laughs, smoke mingling with the warmth of shared supper. Then your thoughts drift to one last detail, the sheer endurance of these vegetables. Cabbage and leeks have outlasted centuries of change, still common in European kitchens today. Every time you toss cabbage into your stir-fry or slice leeks for your soup, you're unknowingly echoing the same choices made by peasants 700 years ago. The continuity is almost comforting. You lean back again, spoon heavy in your hand, and realize that the vegetables of the medieval garden weren't glamorous, but they were heroic in their own quiet way. They stood between hunger and survival, season after season, century after century. And right now, you can almost taste that resilience, spoonful by spoonful. You lift the spoon again, and this time, instead of turnips or barley, what drifts up is something subtler. A whisper of green, the faint perfume of herbs. Sage, parsley, thyme, little sprigs plucked from the edges of gardens or hedgerows, tossed into the pot not for bulk, but for magic. You breathe it in, and suddenly the pottage is no longer just survival food. It's comfort, craft, almost artistry. In a world of scarcity, herbs were the medieval cook's secret weapon. Picture yourself crouching outside the cottage in early summer, your fingers pinching off leaves of mint, rosemary, or sorrel. The garden smells sharp and alive, buzzing with bees, the air filled with the sun's warmth. You bring those handfuls inside, scatter them into the bubbling pot, and just like that, the bland stew transforms into something lively, something worth anticipating. A handful of parsley gives freshness, sage lends depth, thyme adds that earthy hum that makes your spoon linger longer. Medieval cookbooks especially those from noble households like the form of curry in England, list herbs as essential flavorings. While peasants didn't write cookbooks, the evidence from monastic gardens and archaeological digs shows that herbs were widely grown and used across social classes. Without herbs, much of medieval food would have been nearly flavorless, and some medieval folk believed that certain herbs could ward off evil or improve love lives. Basil, for example, was thought to encourage love and fidelity, while sage was said to bring immortality if eaten every day in May. Imagine someone leaning over their pottage, sprinkling sage not only for taste, but to hedge their bets against death itself. That's seasoning with serious ambition. Historians still argue whether herbs in peasant diets were mainly for flavor or more for their perceived medicinal value. Did families sprinkle parsley because it brightened the taste, or because they believed it could ease stomach troubles? Perhaps both. After all, when you didn't have modern medicine, the line between food and healing blurred until the two were inseparable. The sensory details of herbs in pottage can't be ignored. The sharp snap of a sprig between your fingers, the way leaves curl and darken as they hit the hot broth, the subtle shift in aroma, smoke from the fire mingling with the fragrance of crushed sage, and of course, the taste, fresh green bursts hiding inside a spoonful of turnips and barley, making you pause and smile. You lean back, imagining the cook's role. A woman in a wool dress, hair tied back, crouches by the hearth, pinching herbs from a small bundle hanging to dry above the fire. She throws in a handful almost absent-mindedly, without measurements, guided by instinct and memory. The stew doesn't just feed her family, it becomes her signature. Neighbors might say, "Ah, her pottage always has that hint of rosemary," the way we today might say someone's chili is always extra spicy. And here's the humor. Imagine medieval diners arguing, "Too much time in this batch," as if anyone back then had the luxury of complaining about seasoning when the alternative was bland gruel. But even in scarcity, people find ways to fuss about flavor. That, it seems, is timeless. Herbs also carried status. Exotic spices like saffron or pepper were reserved for the wealthy, but common herbs were the poor man's spice rack. A peasant couldn't afford nutmeg, but they could pluck sorrel from the yard. That made herbs democratic, an equalizer in the pot. In every class, from monks to farmers, cooks leaned on the same handful of green leaves to elevate what might otherwise taste like dishwater. You close your eyes for a moment and let the image drift. Bundles of herbs hang drying in smoky kitchens, tucked into sacks for winter use, even stuffed into shoes to keep away foul smells. You chuckle at the thought. Medieval Febreze, except far less effective. Still, there's comfort in knowing that, across the centuries, humans have always wanted not just to eat, but to savor. And as you taste the spoonful again, the herbs dance lightly across your tongue, softening the bitterness of cabbage, lifting the heaviness of barley. It's not luxury, not feasting, but it is something more important. A reminder that even in a world of scarcity, flavor mattered. A reminder that food is never just fuel. It's identity, hope, and sometimes superstition all in one. You stir the pot again, and suddenly you feel the weight of something heavier than cabbage or barley. A bone slips to the surface, its marrow clouding the broth, a little ribbon of fat gleaming in the firelight. This is the rare treasure of peasant pottage. Meat. Not much, never enough, but oh, when fortune smiled, even a scrap of bacon rind or sliver of salted pork could transform the whole pot. You raise the spoon, taste that smoky richness. and realize how extraordinary it must have felt when the thin stew of vegetables and bread suddenly carried the flavor of flesh. In most medieval villages, meat was scarce. You didn't stroll to a butcher every week. Livestock was wealth, too valuable to kill casually. Chickens were kept for eggs, cows for milk, sheep for wool. To slaughter one meant losing a renewable resource. So when a bone or bit of meat entered the pot, it was usually from a special occasion, a rare slaughter, or sometimes sheer luck. Families might add the smallest shank bone, boil it again and again, until every trace of flavor was drawn out. In medieval England, meat consumption among peasants was extremely limited, often restricted to feast days, special religious festivals, or as payment in kind from their lord. Records show that most common folk subsisted far more on grains and vegetables than meat. Meat was a sign of prosperity, and its absence was the mark of poverty. And now, bones weren't just food, they were reused as dice. After gnawing the last bit of marrow from a knuckle bone, some medieval folks polished them into gaming pieces. Imagine sitting around after dinner, rolling dice made from the very animal that flavored your supper. Talk about full-circle recycling. Historians still argue whether peasants truly lacked meat year-round, or if regional differences meant some families had better access. Did coastal villages feast more often on fish? Did woodland peasants snare rabbits or deer despite harsh penalties for poaching? The records are patchy, but the debate lingers. What's clear is that meat was never taken for granted. Every scrap mattered. Now picture the sensory joy of that rare addition. The broth turns richer, its aroma filling the cottage with a savory perfume. Children's eyes widen as they spot a shred of pork drifting in their bowl. Someone jokes that the stew has finally become noble. The taste lingers longer, clinging to the tongue, giving strength for another day in the fields. You laugh softly as you imagine the modern equivalent, the way we fuss over bacon at brunch, piling it on sandwiches or crumbling it over salads as if it's garnish. For medieval peasants, that crispy strick we take for granted would have been the crown jewel of a week's meals. The difference in perspective is almost comical. There were also creative tricks. Sometimes, even when no meat was available, cooks might add bones that had already been picked clean, hoping the pot would draw out the last phantom flavors. Or they might toss in drippings saved from a noble kitchen, scraps scavenged from a market, or even a bit of salted herring if they lived near the coast. You can practically taste the saltiness cutting through the blandness of root vegetables, making the whole dish feel alive again. And imagine the emotional weight on a bitter winter's night when the fields are frozen and bellies are empty. The discovery of a hidden piece of bacon fat could lift spirits as much as fill stomachs, a small luxury that felt like a miracle. The firelight glows against your spoon, the broth thickened with marrow and grease. You sip, close your eyes, and almost feel your body sigh. Rare though it was, meat in pottage was a reminder of plenty, a whisper of the feasts beyond reach. And in those fleeting bites, peasants tasted not just food, but hope. You lean closer to the fire, and suddenly the air shifts. The smoky cottage walls dissolve, and you find yourself standing in the echoing hall of a stone castle. Torches blaze, shadows leap across banners, and at the far end of a long oak table sits a nobleman with a golden goblet. Before him is pottage, too, but not the thin, watery stew of the peasant's hearth. No, this is rich, thick, opulent, shimmering with fat, and colored with spices brought across seas. You lift the ladle, and what spills out is more feast than survival. Meat falling from the bone, grains swollen with broth, saffron streaking the stew, a glowing yellow. The contrast is startling. For peasants, pottage was endurance. For nobles, it was indulgence. Medieval feasts, especially in aristocratic households, often featured pottages at the beginning of the meal, thick with beef, venison, or capons, and lavishly spiced. The form of curry, a famous 14th century English cookbook commissioned by King Richard II's court, lists dozens of such recipes. These weren't the survival stews of cottages. They were culinary displays meant to impress as much as to nourish. But sometimes the noble pottages were so heavily spiced, pepper, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, that they barely tasted of meat at all. Guests could eat a venison stew that smelled more like dessert than dinner. Imagine ladling out what you think is soup, only to be hit with a flavor combo suspiciously close to pumpkin spice latte. Medieval nobility didn't just eat, they showed off. If your pottage tasted like the Silk Road, you were sending a message. Look at me. I can afford saffron that costs more than gold. Historians still argue whether these exotic recipes ever filtered down to common folk, or if they remained exclusively courtly spectacles. Did peasants get tantalized by the aromas drifting out of castle kitchens? Did they sneak tastes when scraps were tossed out to servants? Or was the gap so wide that the flavors of ginger and cinnamon never touched their tongues? The debate lingers, but the divide between rich and poor tables was unquestionable. Picture the sensory scene of a great hall at supper, the clatter of spoons in silver bowls, the hum of music, the laughter of lords and ladies. You see servants moving quickly, ladling thick pottage into ornate dishes, then rushing back for more. You taste the richness. Venison falling apart, rabbit bones picked clean, beef melting into fat. You feel the warmth of wine coursing through the room, and you know this isn't about hunger. It's about spectacle. And yet, here's where you chuckle. The nobles weren't always practical. Spices didn't just mask blandness. They sometimes covered up meat that wasn't exactly fresh. Without refrigeration, even castle kitchens had to get creative. So yes, your lord's saffron stew might have been dazzling, but it might also have been disguising venison that was a few questionable days past its prime. Nothing says power like serving slightly funky meat disguised with enough cloves to make your tongue tingle. The firelight flickers across the hall, and you realize that while peasants scraped marrow from bones, nobles reveled in fat dripping from joints of meat. But at the heart of it, both tables, rich and poor, shared the same word, pottage, one dish, two worlds. As you sip from your imaginary silver bowl, you taste the gulf between classes, and you realize how much food reflected power. Peasant pottage meant survival. Noble pottage meant status. And somewhere between, the smoky cottage and the glittering hall, Europe's story simmered on the same fire. The echoes of the feast hall fade, and you find yourself walking in silence. Stone walls rise around you, cloisters arched and echoing, and the air smells faintly of beeswax and incense. You've stepped into a monastery where the rhythm of bells marks the hours, and even meals are part of prayer. Here, too, the pot of pottage waits, but the flavor is different, gentler, shaped by devotion as much as by hunger. In monastic kitchens, simplicity ruled. No roasted boars, no saffron extravagance, just vegetables, grains, herbs, and occasionally fish. You can almost hear the steady scrape of knives as monks chop leeks, carrots, and onions in silence. The cauldron bubbles not in chaos, but in calm, a low hum beneath chants drifting from the chapel. When you taste this pottage, it isn't indulgence, it's discipline, a meal tied to vows of moderation and humility. Medieval monasteries were not only centers of faith, but also of agriculture and cooking innovation. Monks cultivated gardens filled with vegetables and herbs, and many early written recipes for pottage come from monastic records. Religious rules, like fasting from meat on certain days, shaped the way these stews were prepared. In fact, some monasteries restricted meat entirely, so their pottage relied heavily on fish, dairy, and legumes for protein. And now, some monks believed garlic and onions stirred up impure thoughts, so certain monastic orders banned them from the kitchen. Imagine being scolded by an abbot, not for sneaking wine, but for tossing too much garlic into your pottage. The irony, of course, is that garlic was one of the most common medieval flavorings elsewhere. So while peasants warded off hunger with it, monks were quietly simmering stew without that pungent kick. Historians still argue whether monasteries practiced strict abstinence in food, or if some bent the rules. Did all monks really give up meat, or did they occasionally indulge in secret feasts? Records show contradictions. Some abbots enforced austerity, while others kept surprisingly lavish kitchens. Even in places devoted to prayer, the debate over indulgence versus restraint never quite went away. Picture the sensory quiet of a monastic meal. Rows of monks sit in silence, spoons dipping into bowls, the only sound the scrape of wood against pottery. No laughter, no chatter, just the rhythm of eating, the rhythm of prayer. A reader recites scripture aloud while the others eat, so even the act of nourishment is tied to the divine. You taste leeks simmered to sweetness, barley swollen thick, parsley scattered lightly over the top. Simple, yes, but strangely comforting, like a lullaby in a bowl. And yet, even here, humor sneaks in. You imagine a novice sneaking a second ladleful when the abbot isn't looking, or monks quietly comparing which garden herbs made the stew less dreary. Even in silence, human nature finds its cracks. As you sip again, the monastery fades into you, the cloisters dissolving into mist. You realize that monastic pottage wasn't just food, it was philosophy. Every bite reflected humility, patience, and the belief that feeding the body was inseparable from feeding the soul. And in that soft rhythm of spoon against bowl, the medieval world found a form of peace we still long for today. Monastery walls drift away, and you step into noise, color, and chaos. You're no longer in silence. Now, you're in the heart of a medieval market. Stalls crowd the square. Merchants shout. Children dart between carts. And the smell of roasting meat, fish, and spices collides in the air. This is where pottage takes on a new life, not just as a peasant's necessity or a monk's meditation, but as a dish flavored by the great arteries of trade that reached across continents. Your spoon dips again, and suddenly you taste something unfamiliar, something brighter. Pepper, maybe, sharp against the tongue, or cinnamon, strangely sweet in a stew. You pause, because this isn't what cabbage and barley usually taste like. This is the spice trade at work, the veins of commerce that carry tiny packets of flavor thousands of miles from India, Persia, or the Levant into the pots of Europe. Spices like black pepper, cinnamon, ginger, and saffron were among the most expensive and sought-after commodities of the Middle Ages. They traveled along the Silk Road and maritime routes, changing not only European cuisine, but also its economy and politics. In noble kitchens, these spices transformed pottage from humble sustenance into a dish of prestige. Pepper was so valuable that it was sometimes used as currency. Debts could literally be paid in peppercorns. Imagine dropping a pouch of pepper into a tax collector's hand instead of coins. Now picture sprinkling that same pepper into your pottage. You're not just seasoning dinner, you're cooking with medieval money. Historians still argue whether common folk ever tasted these exotic seasonings. Did pepper or cinnamon trickle down to village pots? Or were they hoarded by lords and wealthy merchants? Some records suggest that tiny amounts occasionally appeared in peasant dishes, often through scraps or charity from noble kitchens. Others insist it was far too rare. The debate lingers, but even the idea that someone might stretch a single peppercorn across a week's worth of meals captures the imagination. You wander deeper into the market square. There's a sack of saffron threads glowing golden in the sun, each one worth more than its weight in silver. You hear the haggling, the disbelief, the laughter when a merchant insists that this bundle of dried flowers can color a whole pot of stew. You smell ginger, sharp and exotic, wafting from a spice stall. The air is alive with possibilities, and your mind lingers on how even a pinch of these treasures could lift a plain stew into something dreamlike. The sensory experience is overwhelming. You sip your imaginary bowl again. Barley still anchors the broth. Cabbage still floats lazily. But there it is, the sting of pepper on the back of your throat, the warmth of ginger at the tip of your tongue. Suddenly the stew tastes like more than survival. It tastes like connection to worlds far beyond your village. And of course, the humor slips in. Imagine the medieval peasant getting their first taste of cinnamon and muttering, "This tastes like sweet wood. Are you sure it's not just bark?" Which, technically, it is. Or picture a cook dropping too much saffron in and being accused of showing off at the church feast. Even back then, flavor came with drama. The fire crackles, the pot simmers, and the market fades into a blur of colors and voices. As you take another spoonful, you realize how extraordinary it was that a simple dish like pottage could carry whispers of faraway lands. A stew simmering in a smoky cottage could, with the right pinch of spice, connect a medieval family to deserts, mountains, and oceans they would never see in. And in that realization, the humble pot becomes something far grander. A vessel of the world's stories, simmering together in broth. The market fades, and you find yourself back at the hearth. The pot bubbles steadily, but your attention shifts from the ingredients to the vessel itself. You crouch down, run your hand along the rim, and feel the pitted surface of clay, the iron scarred with soot, the rough edges patched and repatched. Tonight, the story isn't what's inside the stew. It's the very tools that made it possible. Cooking pottage was always about endurance, and so were the pots. For peasants, the cauldron was often the most valuable object in the household. A single iron pot could cost as much as a cow, and it would be guarded, repaired, passed down for generations. You lean closer and see how the metal is worn thin in places, hammered and riveted, patched like a pilgrim's cloak. It is both fragile and unbreakable at the same time. Archaeological digs across Europe have uncovered cooking vessels, clay cauldrons, iron kettles, and bronze pots that show decades of use. Some have grooves so deep from constant stirring that they look etched on purpose. Others were hung over open hearths with iron hooks, blackened entirely from smoke. These pots weren't disposable. They were the heart of the household, quite literally keeping families alive. And now, in some villages, if a family lost their cooking pot through theft, fire, or accident, they were considered cursed. Neighbors might lend one, but there are records of people so desperate that they tried to cook pottage in wooden buckets, lining them with clay to withstand the fire. Imagine the disaster. Stew leaking out the sides, smoke filling the cottage, neighbors shaking their heads, a reminder that without the right pot, the stew was impossible. Historians still argue whether iron pots were common among peasants, or if most relied on clay. Iron was durable but costly, clay cheaper but fragile. Did poor families truly own sturdy iron kettles, or was that privilege limited to wealthier households? The debate continues. But every excavation shows one truth: no pot meant no meal. The sensory details are vivid. You imagine the heavy clang of an iron cauldron as it set on the hearthstone, the hiss as broth splashes against hot metal, the smoky perfume as steam rises. Stirring with a long wooden spoon, you feel the sides rough beneath your knuckles, the ladle scraping grooves that have deepened year after year. Every sound in the kitchen, the pop of the fire, the scrape of the spoon, the bubbling of the stew, comes back to the pot. And then the tools, the wooden ladles carved crudely from branches, spoons shared among children, trenchers hollowed out into makeshift bowls. Even knives mattered, though few peasants owned more than one. The whole scene feels spare, almost primitive, yet there's ingenuity in every object. People made do, and somehow dinner appeared night after night. You smile at the thought that today we chase after non-stick pans, cast iron skillets, or copper pots, bragging about brands and coatings. Back then, the measure of a cook wasn't how shiny their pan was, but whether it could survive another winter without cracking. And when it did crack, well, then you patched it with whatever you had: iron straps, clay seals, even bits of leather. Imagine explaining to your family, "Don't worry, dinner's fine. I sealed the hole with cowhide." Practical? Maybe. Delicious? Let's hope so. As you take another sip of the stew, the pot itself seems to hum beneath the firelight. It isn't just a container, it's memory. Every scrape of spoon, every patch, every stain is a record of survival. And you realize, as the broth warms you, that the story of pottage isn't just about food. It's also about the tools, silent, enduring companions that turned hunger into sustenance. Year after year, generation after generation. The iron pot bubbles on, and as you lean over it, you realize something subtle but constant. What goes into the stew isn't just about taste, it's about time. The medieval calendar itself shapes the flavor. Seasons dictate what appears in the pot, and each spoonful you take is a reflection of the earth's rhythm. In spring, the pottage is green and light, tender shoots of sorrel, young leeks, early peas, flavor sharp and grassy, a hopeful taste after the gray monotony of winter. You can almost hear the relief in the village as families trade turnips for fresh leaves. The stew looks brighter, smells fresher, tastes like the year beginning again. Summer brings abundance. Beans swell, cabbages broaden, onions pile high. You stir and the broth is thick with variety, a rainbow of roots and leaves tumbling together. Children dart into the fields to pull what's ripe, running back with dirt still clinging to carrots. You smile at their laughter, at the thought that for once, the pot is not stretched thin, but overflowing. Then autumn comes, and the tone shifts. The pottage deepens, turns hearty, braced for the cold ahead. Turnips, parsnips, apples even, whatever can be stored for long months. Smoke from the hearth mingles with the aroma of roots simmering down into comfort. A bowl of autumn stew is less about variety and more about weight, substance, the kind of meal that steels you for hard work and longer nights. And winter is survival. The pot grows thinner, the flavors more muted. What you taste is cabbage pulled from a root cellar, beans dried and soaked, barley from a sack in the corner. Maybe salted meat if fortune smiled, maybe not. Each spoonful feels heavier, not with richness, but with the burden of scarcity. You sip and taste endurance, a quiet resolve. Medieval diets were overwhelmingly seasonal. Unlike today's global markets, where strawberries appear in December and bananas in Alaska, people in the Middle Ages ate what grew locally, when it grew. Pottage was a living calendar. Spring herbs, summer beans, autumn roots, winter grains. And now, some medieval families marked the year not by feast days, but by what their stew tasted like. It must be March. The leeks are back. It must be November. The pottage is thick with turnips. Imagine telling time by your dinner bowl instead of by your clock. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants always had enough variety through the seasons, or if many lived on little more than grain and cabbage most of the year. Was the cycle truly abundant, or is the image of seasonal plenty an optimistic myth? The evidence is patchy, leaving the debate simmering like the stew itself, unresolved but endlessly compelling. The sensory rhythm of these seasons is clear in your bowl. In spring, you sip something light and sharp. In summer, hearty and rich. Autumn gives you comfort, while winter offers determination in every spoonful. The firelight flickers, and you can almost hear the voices of centuries past sighing over the same sequence, grateful or weary depending on the month. You chuckle quietly at the thought of explaining seasonal eating to a medieval peasant. For them, it wasn't a lifestyle trend or a farm-to-table restaurant slogan. It was the only way to eat. No one bragged about it. They endured it. Yet, in that endurance was a wisdom we sometimes forget. Food, like life, has its seasons. And so, as you sip the broth tonight, you're not just tasting vegetables and grain. You're tasting time itself, the march of months, the slow turn of the year, the endless repetition of growth, harvest, hunger, and hope. Each bowl of pottage was a season, and each season a reminder that survival depended on patience with the earth. The seasons fade, and as you hold your spoon, you sense another layer, one that isn't just taste or time, it's belief. Because in the Middle Ages, food was never only food. Every bowl of pottage carried whispers of superstition, hope, and healing. Tonight, the pot before you isn't just dinner. It's medicine, magic, and prayer stirred into broth. You lean in and sip, and someone beside you insists, "This stew will cure your fever." Another swears that a pinch of sage can drive away melancholy, or that parsley wards off evil spirits. You smile, because suddenly the kitchen feels more like a pharmacy than a pantry. And yet, in a world without modern doctors or antibiotics, the kitchen really was the first line of defense. Medieval medical texts, influenced by ancient Greek and Roman theories, often recommended specific foods for healing. Broths and pottages were prescribed for the sick, believed to balance the body's humors, hot, cold, wet, and dry. A bowl of leek and barley stew wasn't just nourishment, it was treatment. One recipe for healing pottage recommended boiling a rooster with sage, hyssop, and fennel, then feeding it only to the patient after whispering a prayer over the pot. Imagine your dinner arriving with not only flavor, but also a side order of divine incantation. Historians still argue whether these concoctions were genuinely effective or more placebo than cure. Did garlic really chase away infections, or was it belief that did half the work? Did hot broth soothe because of its nutrients, or because someone promised it would? The debate lingers, but one thing is clear: food and faith were inseparable. You picture the sensory world of healing pottage, steam rising thick, carrying not only the smell of onions and herbs, but also the weight of expectation. A sick child clutching a wooden bowl, eyes half closed, as the warm broth slips down their throat. A mother watching closely, whispering thanks to God or saints for even the hint of recovery. The sound of spoons stirring softly becomes a kind of ritual, like a chant in itself. And of course, humor sneaks in. Imagine being told that the reason your headache won't go away is because you ate too much cabbage out of season. Or picture someone grumbling, "If this stew doesn't cure me, at least I'll die full." Medieval medicine was often equal parts earnest hope and resigned laughter. The fire crackles, and you realize how powerful belief was in every bite. A pottage wasn't just dinner. It was a talisman, a small shield against the uncertainty of life. When plague, famine, or fever swept through villages, people turned to what they knew best: the pot on the hearth, the herbs in the garden, the prayers whispered into broth. And as you sip your spoonful now, the warmth spreads through you. Not because you're ill, but because you understand. The act of cooking, of eating together, was more than survival. It was comfort, ritual, and healing, whether the cure worked or not. And maybe, just maybe, that's what kept hope alive through centuries of hunger and fear. The pot steams, and this time when you lift your head, the room around you isn't a solitary cottage or a silent cloister. It's alive with chatter. Children giggle, neighbors shuffle in, dogs wag their tails at the edges of the circle. Tonight's pottage is not only food, it's community. You picture yourself sitting on a wooden bench, bowl in hand, shoulder to shoulder with family. Everyone dips into the same pot, sharing not just broth, but laughter. The clink of spoons against bowls becomes its own music, a rhythm of companionship. And as you taste the stew, what you feel most is not flavor, but belonging. In the Middle Ages, meals were almost always communal. Families shared from one pot, and in wealthier households, servants often ate together after lords had finished. Dining was less about individual plates and more about collective bowls. Food reinforced bonds, reminding everyone of their place in the family or the village. There are records of songs sung specifically while stirring or eating pottage. Imagine someone humming a tune that everyone knows, voices rising while the pot bubbles, a simple stew transformed into a stage for shared music. Even the act of ladling could turn into performance. Don't spill where the song stops. Historians still argue whether these shared bowls were a mark of intimacy or simply necessity. Was it about affection, or was it just efficient when plates were scarce? Did people truly cherish the togetherness, or did they sometimes resent it? The evidence is mixed, but what lingers is the sense of closeness at the hearth. The sensory world is vivid, the warmth of bodies huddled close, the smell of smoke mingling with cabbage and herbs, the sound of a father telling a story while children slurp. Someone cracks a joke about the stew being thin enough to see your reflection, and laughter ripples through the room. You smile, because humor always sneaks in, even when the food is meager. You glance around and notice how even the poor found ways to turn dinner into ritual. Perhaps a prayer, perhaps a story told by candlelight, perhaps a moment of silence for the absent. The pot was more than a meal. It was a hearthstone of memory, each spoonful flavored with voices and stories. And you can't help but compare it to today. You picture yourself scrolling on a phone, eating takeout alone. Then you contrast it with that smoky, medieval room where everyone leaned in together, bowls steaming in their hands. Which seems warmer? Which seems more human? You let the thought linger as the fire crackles. As you sip another spoonful, the laughter fades into memory. you realize that pottage wasn't just about what filled the belly. It was about what filled the heart. A bowl shared is a bond. And in a world that knew famine, war, and loss, that bond was the strongest seasoning of all. The laughter softens, the bowl's empty, and you notice the silence that follows a feast. But tonight's silence is heavier. The pot simmers still, but what rises to your spoon isn't abundance, it's scarcity. The broth is thin, the vegetables almost absent, the flavor muted. You taste hunger. This is famine pottage, the shadow side of the dish that kept people alive. You picture a winter when harvests failed, when rain drowned fields, or frost cut them too soon. Granaries stood nearly empty. Root cellars held little more than shriveled turnips. Families gathered around the hearth anyway, because the ritual of the pot could not be abandoned. Into it they threw what scraps remained: a handful of barley husks, bitter weeds from the hedgerow, maybe water thickened with old bread. The stew stretched thinner and thinner until it was little more than flavored water. Europe experienced repeated famines during the Middle Ages, most notably in the early 14th century, during the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. Chroniclers describe people surviving on thin gruel and desperate substitutions, even resorting to acorns and bark ground into meal. Some records suggest people made pottage from pea pods already chewed by livestock. Imagine scraping together cattle leftovers just to coax flavor into boiling water. That wasn't cuisine. It was survival at its starkest. Historians still argue whether famine truly reshaped diets permanently, or if people returned to normal patterns once harvests recovered. Did desperate substitutions like bark bread or weed pottage leave lasting culinary traditions? Or were they forgotten as soon as better food returned? The debate remains unsettled, but the scars of hunger linger in records and memory. The sensory details tonight are bleak. You lift the spoon and taste bitterness from weeds, the broth watery, the steam faint. Children sit silently instead of laughing, their eyes watching the pot even as bowls are empty. The fire crackles, but it cannot disguise the hollow ache in stomachs. A mother stirs slowly, not because when the pot is empty, it's not just dinner that's missing. It's security, comfort, hope. A thin pottage isn't just disappointing, it's terrifying. And yet, humor still finds its way. You imagine someone muttering, "At least this stew won't make us fat." A grim chuckle passing through the room. Medieval folk had resilience, a stubborn refusal to let despair fully extinguish their spirits. You sip again, and the watery broth seems to echo with centuries of scarcity. It's not a taste you crave, but it's one that reminds you how fragile survival was. Pottage in famine wasn't nourishment. It was a reminder of how close to the edge medieval life always balanced, and somehow, in that edge, people endured, clinging to the ritual of the pot, even when it offered little more than hot water and hope. The thin, famine broth lingers on your tongue, but as you blink, the scene changes. Scarcity melts into abundance once more. Not the fleeting wealth of noble feasts, but something sturdier. You're tracing how this humble pottage, once just survival, began to branch into regional specialties, dishes that would outlast the Middle Ages and define entire cuisines. Tonight, the pot before you is no longer only peasant stew. It's the seed of national food identity. Take France, for example. From medieval pottages came hearty soups like pot au feu, still considered a national treasure. Beef, bones, root vegetables, exactly the same building blocks. but refined into something proudly French. You sip and taste the lineage, smoky marrow and tender carrot, humble roots dressed in prestige. Or England, where pottage slowly evolved into dishes like peas porridge. Yes, the very one from the nursery rhyme, peas porridge hot, peas porridge cold. What was once a nursery chant was also a historical reality. Peas porridge was pottage made thick with dried peas, hearty enough to sit in a pot for days. You grin, realizing that rhyme isn't just playful. It's culinary memory sung across centuries. By the late medieval and early modern period, regional variations of pottage had already begun to crystallize into the national dishes we still recognize today. Recipes for barley broth in Scotland, cabbage soups in Germany, lentil stews in Italy, all trace their roots back to the same medieval cauldron. Some towns became so proud of their particular pottage variation that they argued about it in local rivalries. There are records of guilds boasting that their stew had the superior mix of grains or meats. Imagine heated debates over whose cabbage soup reigned supreme, long before anyone thought to argue about pizza toppings. Historians still argue whether these dishes should be called direct descendants of medieval pottage, or if the connections are too stretched, is modern French pot-au-feu really the same dish, refined, or just a distant cousin with a borrowed name? Is Scottish porridge truly medieval pottage, or did it evolve independently? The debate simmers on, like the stew itself. The sensory experience tonight is one of recognition. You lift your spoon and taste something oddly familiar, something you might have eaten yourself in a modern kitchen. Lentils, carrots, onions, a bit of bone broth. It's no longer alien. The past folds into the present. The flavors of medieval survival live quietly in the soups and stews we still ladle onto our tables today. And here's where humor slides in. Imagine trying to tell a medieval peasant that their thin cabbage stew would one day be served in Michelin-starred restaurants as rustic heritage cuisine. They'd probably laugh hard enough to spill their bowl. Yet here we are, paying good money for dishes their families once ate because there was nothing else. You sip again, and this time the broth feels richer, not just in flavor, but in meaning. Each regional twist, each national pride, each modern recipe is a thread back to the same smoky cottages and bubbling cauldrons. Pottage didn't just feed bodies, it shaped identities. It gave Europe's kitchens a starting point, a shared dish that later became 1,000 different flavors. And so, as you let the steam rise to your face, you realize the story of pottage is no longer about peasants or nobles alone. It's about how one humble stew became a bridge between regions, between centuries, between survival and celebration. The taste of regional pride still lingers on your tongue, but as the pot bubbles one final time, your vision shifts forward, past castles, past cloisters, past famine years and feast halls. You find yourself in a modern kitchen, where the hum of a refrigerator replaces the crackle of firewood, and stainless steel pots gleam where blackened cauldrons once hung. And yet, when you lift your spoon, you realize what you're tasting hasn't really changed. Soup, stew, chowder, gumbo, chili. These are today's heirs of pottage. You ladle broth thick with vegetables, grains, maybe meat, and you feel the echo of medieval Europe in every sip. That's simple logic. Throw what you have into the pot. Let time and heat work their alchemy. Remains unchanged. Your modern bowl is garnished, seasoned, Instagrammed. But at its core, it's the same. A survival dish that turned into comfort food. Food historians often identify medieval pottage as the direct ancestor of many European national dishes, from French pot-au-feu to English pea soup to Italian minestrone. Its basic formula, grain, vegetable, optional meat, proved so adaptable that it became the foundation of countless culinary traditions. In some rural English towns, Pottage Day still survives as a festival dish, served in big communal pots during fairs. Imagine 21st century villagers standing around with paper bowls, eating something their ancestors slurped 700 years earlier, only now with plastic spoons and a marching band in the background. Historians still argue whether we romanticize pottage too much. Was it really the great unifier of medieval society? Or was it just unavoidable monotony, a dish people endured more than celebrated? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between. It was dull until it wasn't, dreary until hunger made it sacred, humble until scarcity made it heroic. The sensory continuity is undeniable. You sip modern chicken noodle soup, and it tastes like comfort after illness. Just as healing broth did for peasants. You dip crusty bread into beef stew, and it feels like strength after work, just as barley pottage once did after harvest. You stir lentils with carrots and onions, and it smells like patience simmering on the stove, just as cabbage and leeks once did above smoky hearths. And here's the humor. Imagine telling a medieval cook that their endless stew would one day be romanticized as slow food, the height of mindful living. They'd probably roll their eyes and say, "Slow? It's only slow because it takes all day to soften the turnips." You smile, because you realize pottage never really disappeared. It simply changed clothes, dressed itself up in new names, and traveled across time. It lives in every pot of soup simmering on a Sunday, every stew thickening for winter suppers, every bowl of comfort someone makes for the sick or weary. Pottage whispers in our kitchens still, reminding us of hunger, yes, but also of resilience, of community, of survival made warm and edible. The fire dims, and you set your spoon down. The story of pottage has carried you from smoky cottages to glittering feasts, from monastic gardens to modern kitchens. And as the last steam rises, you let it fade into quiet, into memory, into dreams. And now, let everything soften. The fire that once crackled in a medieval hearth flickers low in your imagination, its smoke curling into the night. The pot that bubbled endlessly, full of barley and cabbage, meat and marrow, herbs and hope, settles into silence. You've traveled far with it, from the hush of cloisters to the noise of markets, from famine's thin broth to feasts rich with saffron. And yet all of it returns to the same image, a simple bowl in your hands. Feel the weight of that bowl grow lighter. Smell the last trace of steam fade into cool air. The laughter of families, the chants of monks, the bargaining cries of markets, all dissolve until only quiet remains. Every story we followed tonight, every flavor and every whisper of history lingers only as warmth in your chest. You breathe deeply, and your body slows. The rhythms of the medieval year, the sprouting of spring, the harvest of autumn, the long wait of winter, become gentle tides, steady, predictable, reassuring. Just as the stew carried peasants through storms and nobles through banquets, this story carries you now into rest. Let your mind loosen its grip. Let your thoughts grow slower, softer, like pottage simmering down at the end of the night. The spoon slips from your hand, the bowl drifts away, and you are left with nothing but peace. Sleep now with the comfort of knowing that even in the hardest centuries, people found warmth in simple things. May your dreams be full of quiet hearts, gentle laughter, and bowls that never empty. Sweet dreams.